미디어 심리학 11주 2차 강의를 시작하겠습니다. 챕터 11은 성격입니다. 만약 여러분이 중요하지 않은 물건을 잊어버렸다거나 친구의 이름을 실수로 잘못 불렀다면 대수롭지 않은 실수라고 생각할 것입니다. 하지만 프로이드는 일상생활의 정신병이라고 부른 그런 아주 사소한 실수들을 그냥 지나쳐 보지 않았습니다. 프로이트는 성격을 개인차를 기술하기 위한 광범위한 이론으로 보려고 하기보다 한 사람의 사고와 행동에서 아주 작은 문제들을 주의 깊게 분석함으로써 그에 대한 의미와 통찰을 얻고자 성격을 세부적으로 들여다보았습니다. 신체적인 문제에서 나온 것으로 보이지 않는 그런 질환 때문에 그를 찾아오는 환자들을 치료하면서 그는 그들이 공통적으로 갖고 있는 프로이트식 실수라고 불리는 마인드버그의 원천을 알아보기 시작했습니다. 논란이 끊이지 않는 이 이론을 이해하기 위해서 무의식적인 동기, 마음의 구조, 심리적 방어, 성격 발달들을 알아보도록 하겠습니다. 프로이트는 그의 성격 이론과 환자 치료 방법 모두를 정신분석, 사이코 어널리시스라는 용어로 명명하였습니다. 따라서 정신분석이라는 용어를 프로이트 외에 딴 분야에 적용하게 되면 언어에 혼란이 생깁니다. 프로이트는 우리가 우리 자신의 가장 심층에 있는 동기를 알 수 없기 때문에 성격은 그것을 갖고 있는 사람에게도 하나의 미스터리라고 생각했습니다. 프로이트 이론과 융과 아들러 등 그의 추종자들의 이론을 포함해서 정신역동적 접근이라고 부릅니다. 정신역동적 접근은 의식 저변에 내재하는 힘입니다. 성격을 주로 의식 밖의 영역에서 작용하는 요구, 갈망, 욕망에 의해서 형성되며 이 동기들이 정서적 문제를 불러일으킬 수 있는 것으로 보는 하나의 접근입니다. 프로이트는 마음의 구조를 원초와 자아, 초자아로 나누었습니다. 영어로 이드, 이고, 슈퍼이고라고 합니다. 프로이트는 마음이 성격의 구조를 결정하는 세 개의 시스템으로 구성된다고 제안했습니다. 그것들은 독립적이면서 상호작용하며 종종 갈등 관계에 있습니다. 원초와는 태초부터 존재하는 추동을 포함하는 마음의 부분입니다. 신체적 요구, 욕구, 욕망, 그리고 특히 성적 추동과 공격적 추동인 충동의 원천입니다. 자아는 외부 세계와의 접촉에서 발달되어 나오는 것으로서 생의 현실적인 요구를 처리할 수 있게 해주는 성격 부분입니다. 초자아는 내면화된 문화적 규칙을 반영하는 심리체계로서 주로 부모가 그들의 권위를 행사하는 과정에서 학습됩니다. 이 그림은 오른쪽부터 원초와 자아, 초자아를 나타낸 것입니다. 여기서 프로이트와 그의 사이코테라피를 설명하는 동영상을 보도록 하겠습니다.
This is a thinker who helps us understand why our lives and relationships are full of so much confusion and pain. He tells us why life is hard and how to cope. His own life incurred a lot of anxieties. Sigmund Shlomo Freud was born to a middle-class Jewish family in 1856. His professional life was not an immediate success. As a medical student, he dissected hundreds of eels in an unsuccessful attempt to locate their reproductive organs. He promoted cocaine as a medical drug, but it turned out to be a dangerous and addictive idea. A few years later, he founded the discipline that would ultimately make his name, a new psychological medicine he called psychoanalysis. The landmark study was his 1900 book, The Interpretation of Dreams. Many others followed. Despite his success, he was often unhappy. During some particularly strenuous research, he recorded, "The chief patient I am preoccupied with is myself." He was convinced he would die between 61 and 62 and had great phobias about those numbers, although he actually died much later at the age of 83. Perhaps because of his frustrations, Freud achieved a series of deep insights into the sources of human unhappiness. He proposed that we are all driven by the pleasure principle, which inclines us towards easy physical and emotional rewards. and away from unpleasant things like drudgery and discipline. As infants, we are guided more or less solely according to the pleasure principle, Freud argued. But it will, if adhered to without constraints, lead us to dangerous, reckless things like never doing any work or eating too much, or most notoriously, trying to sleep with members of our own family. We need to adjust to what Freud called the reality principle. Though we all have to bow to this reality principle, Freud believed that there were better or worse kinds of adaptations. He called the troublesome ones neuroses. Neuroses are the result of faulty negotiations with, or in Freud's language, repression of, the pleasure principle. Freud described a conflict between three parts of our minds: the id, driven by the pleasure principle, and the superego, driven by a desire to follow the rules and do the right thing according to society, and the ego, which has to somehow accommodate between the other two. To understand more about these dynamics, Freud urges to think back to the origins of our neuroses in childhood. As we grow up, we go through what Freud termed the oral phase, where we deal with all the feelings around ingestion and eating. If our parents aren't careful, we might pick up all kinds of neuroses here. We might take pleasure in refusing food, or turn to food to calm ourselves down, or hate the idea of depending on anyone else for food. Then comes the anal phase, which is closely aligned with what we now call potty training. During this period, our parents tell us what to do and when to go. At this phase, we begin to learn about testing the limits of authority. Again, if things go wrong here, if we don't feel that authority is benign enough, we might, for example, choose to withhold out of defiance. Then, as adults, we might become anally retentive, in other words, not able to give or to surrender. Next comes the phallic phase, which goes on until about the age of 6. Freud shocked his contemporaries by insisting that little children have sexual feelings. Moreover, in the phallic phase, children direct their sexual impulses towards their parents, the most immediately available and gratifying people around. Freud famously described what he called the Oedipus complex, where we are unconsciously predisposed towards being in love with the one parent and hating the other. What is complex is that no matter how much our parents love us, they cannot extend this to sexual life and will always have to have another life with a partner. This makes our young selves feel dangerously jealous and angry, and also ashamed and guilty about this anger. The complex provides a huge amount of internalized worry for a small child. Ultimately, most of us experience some form of confusion around our parents that later ties into our ideas of love. Mum and Dad may both give us love, but they often mix it with disturbed behavior. Yet because we love them, we remain loyal to them and also to their bizarre destructive patterns. For example, if our mother is cold, we will be apt nevertheless to long for her, and as a result, however, we may be prone to always associate love with a certain distance. Naturally, the result is very difficult adult relationships. Often the kind of love we've learnt from Mum and Dad means we can't fuse sex and love, because the people we learnt about love from are also those we were blocked from having sex with. We might find that the more in love with someone we are, the harder it becomes to make love to them. This can reach a pitch of crisis after a few years of marriage and some kids. Freud compared the issues we so often have with intimacy to hedgehogs in the winter. They need to cuddle for warmth, but they also can't come too close because they're prickly. There's no easy solution. Freud says we can't make ourselves fully rational, and we can't change society either. In his 1930 book, Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud wrote that society provides us with many things, but it does this by imposing heavy dictates upon us, insisting that we sleep with only a few, usually one other person, imposing the incest taboo, requiring us to put off all our immediate desires, demanding that we follow authority and work to make money. Society themselves are neurotic. That is how they function, and that's why there are constant wars and other political troubles. Freud attempted to invent a treatment for our many neuroses. He called it psychoanalysis. He thought that with a little proper analysis, people could uncover what ails them and better adjust to the difficulties of reality. In his sessions, he analyzed a number of key things. He looked at people's dreams, which he saw as expressions of wish fulfillments. He also looked at parapraxes, or slips of the tongue. We now call these revealing mistakes Freudian slips. like when we write thigh when we wanted to write though. He also liked to think about jokes. He believed that jokes often help us make fun of something symbolic like death or marriage, and thus relieve some of our anxiety about these topics. There's a temptation to say that Freud just made everything up and life isn't quite so hard as he makes it out to be. But then one morning we find ourselves filled with inexplicable anger towards our partner or running high with unrelenting anxiety on the train to work, and we're reminded all over again just how elusive, difficult and Freudian our mental workings actually are. We could still reject his work, of course, but as Freud said, no one who disdains the key will ever be able to unlock the door. We could all use a bit more of Freud's ideas to help us unpick ourselves.
자아가 불안이라는 형태의 경고 신호를 받으면 그 불안을 물리치기 위한 시도로서 방어적 입장에 돌입합니다. 프로이트에 의하면 자아는 먼저 고통스러운 경험이나 수용되지 않는 충동을 의식으로부터 제거하는 과정인 억압을 시도합니다. 억압은 때때로 동기화된 망각으로 불립니다. 사실상 기억의 억압에 관한 신경학적 증거에 의하면 이러한 형태의 심적 통제는 기억에 있어서 중심적 역할을 담당하는 해마의 활동을 감소시킵니다. 억압은 수용하기 어려운 추동이 의식으로 들어오는 것을 막아내지 못할 수도 있습니다. 그런 일이 일어나기 시작하면 자아는 방어기제, 디펜스 메커니즘이라고 불리는 자기 기만적 방법을 동원하는데 이것은 수용할 수 없는 충동에 의한 위협에서 생기는 불안을 감소시키려는 무의식적 대처 기제입니다. 프로이트에 따르며 정신역동 이론가인 안나 프로이트는 많은 유형의 방어 기제를 밝혀내었고 이들이 어떻게 작동하는지를 상세하게 설명하였습니다. 가장 일반적인 방어 기제 몇 가지를 살펴보겠습니다. 합리화, rationalization은 자신의 숨겨진 동기나 감정을 감추기 위해서 수용될 수 없는 감정이나 행동에 대해서 그럴듯해 보이는 설명을 갖다 붙이는 방어 기제입니다. 반동 형성, reaction formation은 위협적인 내적 욕구나 환상을 무의식적으로 정반대의 과장된 형태로 대체하는 방어 기제입니다. 투사, projection은 자신이 갖고 있는 위협적인 감정, 동기 또는 충동을 다른 사람이나 다른 집단에게로 그 원인을 돌리는 방어 기제입니다. 퇴행, regression은 발달의 초기 단계로 되돌아감으로써 내적 갈등과 지각된 위협을 처리하는 방어 기제입니다. 취환, displacement는 수용할 수 없는 욕망이나 추동을 중립적이거나 덜 위협적인 대안으로 바꾸는 방어 기제입니다. 동일시, identification은 더 힘있어 보이거나 난관을 더 잘 극복할 수 있는 사람의 특성을 무의식적으로 자신의 것으로 채택함으로써 위협이나 불안 감정을 처리하는데 도움을 주는 방어 기제입니다. 승화, sublimination은 용납되지 않은 추동을 사회적으로 용인되고 문화적으로 가치가 있는 활동으로 전환하는 방어 기제입니다. 반동 형성을 통하여 적대감을 과장된 형태의 애정으로 가려버릴 수 있습니다. 방어 기제에 따르면 친구의 목을 장난삼아 조르는 것이 기제에 깔려있는 감정을 방어하는 것일 수도 있습니다. 사진의 왼쪽에 있는 젊은 여성은 가정불화, 불안정, 약물 중독 등으로 얼룩진 황폐한 환경에서 성장했습니다. 그녀가 17살 때 5살 때 사진을 보게 되었고 그 후에 오른쪽 사진처럼 퇴행을 겪게 되었습니다. 여기서 안나 프로이트와 그녀의 방어 기제에 대해서 관련된 동영상을 보도록 하겠습니다.
Anna Freud was the daughter of the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. She was born in Vienna in 1895, when her father's radical theories of sex and the mind were starting to make him famous across Europe. She became a school teacher and then a psychoanalyst, and pioneered the treatment of children, establishing clinics and nurseries for children who were war victims, survivors of the Holocaust, or just generally troubled by their lives. Perhaps most importantly for us, she is our finest guide to what we call defense mechanisms, which she described best in her 1936 book, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. The book laid out for the first time the core idea that we instinctively try to protect our ego, our acceptable picture of who we are, with a variety of defenses. The problem is that in the act of defending ourselves against pain in the immediate term, we harm our longer-term chances of dealing with reality, and therefore of developing and maturing as a result. Anna Freud highlighted 10 key types of defense mechanisms. Firstly, denial. Denial is when we don't admit there is a problem. We think things like, I enjoy drinking very much and I sometimes get quite bad hangovers, but I can handle it. If other people try to get us to face up to the problem, we react very badly. The immediate survival mechanism, the short-term instinct to feel all right about oneself, means refusing to recognize our need for change. Projection. In projection, you attribute a bad feeling you have in someone else. For example, you might develop the impression that your partner is going to be extremely critical if you don't make more money this year than last. But in reality, they may be quite understanding and sympathetic. The harsh, bitter thoughts are not in your partner, they're in you, and they came from, let's say, your mother. But you've given the negative feelings, which you don't want to recognize in yourself, to someone else. That's projection. Turning against the self. This is when we think badly of ourselves as a way of escaping from an even worse thought, that someone we hope loves us doesn't actually. Anna Freud learnt that children do this a lot. A child abused by a parent will typically seek refuge in a thought which, though grim, is less awful than the alternatives. He or she will think, I must be bad and worthless, that's why my parent is behaving this way towards me. So really the thought goes, I still have a good parent. It's painful to think we're bad and worthless, of course, but for a fragile child especially, it can feel less catastrophic than the alternative, thinking we're in the hands of a parent who doesn't care. Sublimation. We sublimate when we redirect unacceptable thoughts or emotions, often about sex or violence, into higher and finer channels. Many artists, especially musicians, have used sublimation to turn negative life experiences like drug addiction, social ills, family problems, and so on, into popular and resonant works of art. Sublimation is still a defense mechanism, but it's one of the very best. Regression. Anna Freud believed that when things become tough, we often regress to a way of behaving that we practiced when we were younger. In particular, we do what children typically do, which is evade responsibility. It is for the child always someone else's fault, usually the parents, and they should put it right. In regression, we adopt an infantile sense of our own purity and innocence. The rest of the world is to blame. They should sort it out. For Anna Freud, it's normal for many otherwise perfectly sane adults to go through regressive moments when under pressure. It only becomes a problem when it goes on too long. Rationalization. Rationalization is a smart-sounding excuse for our actions or what happens to us, but it's carefully tailored to get the conclusion we feel we need, that we are innocent, nice, worthy. After being rejected for a job, for example, the defensive rationalizer will say, it was a boring company, or I never wanted the job anyway. They may have very much desired the job, but it can be agonizing and deeply humiliating to admit this to the ego. Intellectualization. Intellectualization is similar. The scarring sense of loss, guilt, betrayal, and anger on breaking up with a partner might be neutralized by thinking a lot about the history of the late Roman Empire or the government's plans to raise interest rates. Many intellectuals are not merely thinking a lot, they are also guilty of intellectualization, which means making sure their researches keep a range of more pertinent issues at bay. Reaction formation. Reaction formation involves doing the opposite of our initial unacceptable feelings. Someone who has a strong interest in the sexuality of teenagers, say, may join a religion with a particular emphasis on abstinence among the young. We're often guilty of reaction formation in childhood. When we're embarrassed about being attracted to a classmate, we might be mean or aggressive towards them instead of admitting that we like them. Displacement. Displacement is the redirection of a usually aggressive desire to a substitute recipient, usually someone who is less threatening or easier to blame. So a classic case is someone who may feel threatened by their boss, comes home and starts shouting at their partner. Fantasy. Fantasy avoids problems by imagining them away or disassociating oneself from reality, from daydreaming to reading literature to looking at porn. We use these moments to transport ourselves from the threatening world to find comfort in an elsewhere. Anna Freud's tone when writing about defense mechanisms is tender and generous. She knows these defenses are quite natural, but she also observes how many difficulties they bring in their wake. They hold back our careers, they're boring for others, and they hurt those who love us. Freud argued that most of us employ at least 5 of her defense mechanisms every day without being in any way aware of it. She wrote her great book as a way of helping us to see a little better what we're constantly doing, in the hope that we can in future be a little more mature and a little less, as we still say in unknowing tribute to her, defensive towards those around us.
프로이트는 심리성적 단계와 성격의 발달을 주장했습니다. 구순기 오럴 스테이지는 입과 빨기, 수유 등과 관련되는 즐거움과 욕구불만의 경험이 집중됩니다. 항문기 애널 스테이지는 배변 훈련 등과 관련된 쾌락과 욕구불만에 의해서 주도됩니다. 남근기 펠릭 스테이지는 오이디푸스 갈등과 관련이 있는데 발달 과정에서 겪는 경험으로서 이 경험을 통해서 아동의 이성 부모에 대한 갈등적 감정은 동성 부모에 대한 동일시로 귀결되며 해소됩니다. 잠복기 레이턴시 스테이지는 1차적인 초점이 지능, 창조성, 대인관계 및 운동기술을 발달시키는 것입니다. 성기기 제니털 스테이지는 상호간의 만족스럽고 호혜적 방식으로 타인과 사랑하고 일하고 관계를 맺는 성숙한 성격인 화해의 시기입니다. 오이디푸스는 그리스 신화에 나오는 비극적 인물인데 프로이트는 이 신화를 아동이 성장 과정에서 그들의 부모에 대한 애증의 감정을 느끼면서 겪게 되는 고통스러운 투쟁에 대한 운유로 사용했습니다. 어펜딕스입니다. 지금까지 시청하신 것으로 이번 차스의 수업이 인정됩니다. 프로이드와 융의 관계를 보여주는 동영상을 보도록 하겠습니다.
When Sigmund Freud first met Carl Jung, they talked non-stop for 13 hours. This was 1907, and for the next 6 years, the friendship blossomed. Freud was famous already for his psychoanalytic method, and Jung was a young Swiss psychiatrist. It was a passionate and surpassingly weird relationship, which, given the people involved, perhaps shouldn't come as a surprise. Freud called Jung the Joshua to my Moses, fated to enter the promised land, which I myself will not live to see. High praise and lots of pressure, to be sure.
In 1909, they traveled together to America in order to give lectures on psychoanalysis.
When they disembarked in New York Harbor, Freud said to Jung, "They don't realize that we are bringing them the plague," which has always struck me as a particularly badass thing to have said. Their trip to the US was a success, and they spent lots of time together analyzing one another's dreams. It was around this time that Jung wrote to Freud, "Let me enjoy your friendship not as one between equals, but as that of father and son. This is undoubtedly an odd thing to say in any friendship, but especially this one. When your friend is the originator of the Oedipal complex, the idea that the son, on some unconscious level, wants to kill the father." This did not go unnoticed by Freud, and he freaked out a little. One day, chatting in a German cafe, Jung started talking about mummified corpses. Freud interpreted this as Jung wanting to kill his father, in this case, Freud himself. He fainted and had to be revived. Not long after that, it all began to unravel. Not just because of their strange relationship, or because they got sick of each other, although they clearly did. No, there was a real intellectual disagreement. Freud was all about sex. The libido, in its repression, is the most basic cause of human behavior and human failure. The unconscious is where all these dangerous, messed up emotions and desires are stored away under lock and key, inaccessible except through psychoanalysis. Freud saw sex everywhere. Jung thought that that was a bit much. The other wedge in their friendship was Jung's interest in religion and myth. Jung believed in the collective unconscious, a sort of humanity-wide reservoir of universal symbols that make up the stuff of culture. Freud rejected the idea as flatly unscientific. Freud thought Jung betrayed psychoanalysis by becoming a mystic. Jung hoped that a statue would fall on Freud's head. At last, Freud ended it all in a letter from 1913. But one, meaning Jung, who while behaving abnormally keeps shouting that he is normal, gives ground for the suspicion that he lacks insight into his illness. Accordingly, I propose that we abandon our personal relations entirely. And that was that. The rest is silence, Jung noted in his diary. Only it wasn't. Freud's output increased in his later years, reaching for more shibboleths to demolish. Jung's later writing proliferated as his ideas of archetypes and the collective unconscious hoovered up everything, from mythology to flying saucers. Jung inspired artists like Jackson Pollock and Jorge Borges, and existentialists like Viktor Frankl. But who triumphed in the end? Which thinker can lay claim to greater influence? Of course, it's the one that told us that our conscious life is only the tip of the mental iceberg, that found sex and death to pervade our behavior, that described parental relationships as rather more complicated than they seem, and that most of all gave us the theories of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud.